Well, Treasurer Dr Jim Chalmers and his Finance Minister Katie Gallagher gave their mid-year budget report today, and it was exactly as you would expect when the country's finances are being run by an academic and an ex-union official, splashing money in a bid to lower inflation, complaining that $58.3 billion in extra spending this financial year was unavoidable, and smiling while announcing that 4 years of back-to-back budget deficits will plunge us $143 billion further into the red. Joining me is Leith Van Onselen, co-founder of Macro Business and a former Federal Treasury official. Leith, let me start with the Treasurer's $58.3 billion in extra spending this financial year. Chalmers is stoking the economy at the very time the RBA is trying to dampen demand, is he not?
Absolutely, James. We've got a burnt-out economy at present. So the RBA has its foot planted on the brake. It's trying to slow the economy with high interest rates. Meanwhile, the federal government is pumping demand via its record spending. And as a result of its record spending, that's preventing the Reserve Bank from cutting interest rates. So, yeah, it's a bit of a strange situation we've got at the moment.
Now, government spending comprises a whopping 27.2% of GDP. And I think outside of the pandemic, we haven't seen government prop up that much of the economy since the recession in the early 80s. This is not a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. These numbers are off the chart. So public spending's increased from an average of around 22.5% of GDP in the decade before the pandemic. And as of the Q3 national accounts, it was tracking at a record high 27.5% of GDP. And it's not just that, James, it's also the on the job side of the equation. So the non-market economy, so those are your government-funded jobs, their share of total hours worked across the economy has increased to a record high of nearly 28%, and that's up from a decade average of 22%. So, in fact, over the last 2 years, virtually all of Australia's jobs growth has been in this non-market government-aligned sector. By contrast, the market sector or the private sector of the economy is in recession. It's experienced near zero jobs growth and near zero activity of jobs. And again, it's this blowout in public spending and government-funded jobs that is preventing the Reserve Bank of Australia from cutting interest rates.
So there's a sea of red as far as the eye can see, with Chalmers and Gallagher projecting 4 years of back-to-back budget deficits. We're seeing this all around the Western world. At what point does the government say, you know what, we need to get back into surplus, or are those days gone? What's the plan here?
Yeah, it's certainly a worry. So the headline budget deficits, and the headline's the better figure. So the underlying deficit's the one they usually quote, but the headline is basically the underlying deficit plus the off-budget items, which are still expenditures. And that's cumulatively going to hit $233 billion of deficits over the next 4 years. And that's a $34 billion deterioration on the May budget. So it's gotten worse. And also the budget's projected to be in deficit for the next decade, James. So this is an ugly set of numbers. And what it basically highlights is that in Australia, we need fundamental tax reform to basically broaden the tax base away from just slugging workers and corporations. We need to have, higher consumption taxes, and I'd argue also tax our mineral resources better. But also we need the government to more strongly control the expenditure side of the equation, because at the moment we've got a structurally broken budget.
Leith, one more question I wanted to ask you. I'm sure many of our viewers would have heard the Treasurer talk continually today about the fact that these numbers are $200 billion better than they had been forecast. That was his big boast. Just tell us what he's talking about there, and is that anything to boast about?
Yeah, look, he's right, but it's not for anything the government's done. So basically, the government was kissed on the backside when it came into office for three main factors. So Russia invaded Ukraine, and what happened was that spiked commodity prices, and everything Australia sells to the rest of the world went up in price, and that showered massive amounts of money on the federal government. It also, brought in record numbers of migrants, way more than was forecast. And what that did was that increased personal income tax receipts, because most of those migrants worked. But all the costs of those migrants were deferred onto the state budgets. And then obviously we had higher inflation and higher nominal wage growth, even though our actual real wages after inflation went backwards. And what that did is that gave more money to the taxman because it pushed us into higher tax brackets. So it was really just luck that basically showered the Albanese government with about $300 billion in windfall revenue. and it's gone and spent a lot of that money and obviously pushed up demand and pushed up in inflation across the economy. So it was more a case of good luck rather than good management. But those good times are now over because the forces that gave us that budget windfall are now reversing.
And the Treasurer has the hide to boast about it as if it was his achievement in order to disguise what, as I said, is a pretty bleak set of figures. Leith Van Onselen, appreciate you explaining that for us tonight.